Fields of the Stranger Ezekiel Muya Part I. When the sky closed. Prologue. The valley had always been patient. Hills rolled gently into one another, the river wound through its bones like a quiet whisper, and the wind carried the scent of earth and grain. To the unprepared it was indifferent, a backdrop to life, neither cruel nor kind. Yet to those who listened, who observed with care and endurance, it spoke in subtle rhythms. The sway of barley, the pause in a labourer's step, the quiet acknowledgement of presence. Leora arrived at this place uncertain and wary, carrying little more than the lessons of survival and the shadows of a past she could not forget. She would learn quickly that endurance alone would not be enough. Observation, patience, and subtle action were the true measures here. The valley would test her. It would not speak, it would not explain, but it would reveal truths to those who watched carefully and moved deliberately. In its stillness it taught, and in its indifference it judged. And Leora, guided by the quiet wisdom of Maril, would discover the power that lies not in command, but in understanding, power that moves unseen, acknowledged without words, and lasting without demand. This is the story of her journey through patience, perception, and quiet mastery. A story of presence shaped by the rhythms of the land, of subtle influence earned through care, and of the courage to act deliberately in a world that observes without speaking. Author's note, Whispers in the Valley, is inspired by the essence of timeless stories of loyalty, guidance, and personal growth. It is not a retelling of familiar tales, but a reimagining that captures the spirit of endurance, courage, and quiet influence. Through Leora's journey, I wanted to explore the subtle ways in which presence and observation shape relationships and outcomes, and how personal strength is often forged in silence and patience rather than overt action. The valley itself is both setting and teacher, a reminder that the world often measures us not by our words, but by our attention, care, and deliberate choices. This novel invites readers to walk alongside Leora, to witness her transformation, and perhaps to consider the quiet power in their own lives. The influence we exert, the recognition we earn, and the patience required to truly master both ourselves and the world around us. Ezekiel Muya Chapter 1. Exile and arrival. The road stretched long and empty beneath the morning sun, the dust curling up around their feet with each step. Leora's hand rested lightly in Maril's, the warmth of her grip both comforting and grounding. They moved slowly, carrying only what they could bear, the valley rising ahead like a vast, patient sentinel. Its hills rolled one into another, gentle yet indifferent, as if measuring every traveller for endurance and attention. Leora's chest ached, not from the weight of the bundles she carried, but from the uncertainty that hung over the journey. She had left behind all she knew, all she trusted, yet the valley offered no welcome, no instructions, only its quiet, exacting presence. Maril walked beside her with calm precision, her steps light yet deliberate. "The valley does not yield to weakness," she said softly, her voice barely above the whisper of wind across the hills. "It tests, it observes, and it waits. Those who endure quietly will find their place. Those who do not are forgotten." Nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She tried to match Maril's measured steps, letting the rhythm of her feet follow the path laid out by the hills. The dust clung to her hair, to her sleeves, to her weary skin, yet she kept moving. She had learned early that hesitation here was a luxury she could not afford. A breeze stirred, lifting loose strands of barley from the fields to their left. Leora's eyes followed the motion, noting how the stalks bent but did not break, how the wind passed over them without violence, how even in motion, the field held its shape. She thought of herself, of the valley, and of the challenge that lay ahead. Here, endurance alone would not be enough. She would need attention, awareness, and subtle action to survive. The settlement came into view at last, a scattering of low stone houses pressed into the valley floor. Smoke curled faintly from chimneys, drifting lazily across the fields. Labourers moved in careful rhythm, carrying baskets and tending to oxen, their movements both practiced and quiet. Leora noticed the small gestures, the tilt of a head, a pause before lifting, a glance exchanged without words. The valley's language was in these details, and Maril had already begun to teach her to read it. "We will start tomorrow," Maril said, releasing Leora's hand for a moment to adjust the straps of her own bundle. "Observe first, learn, move deliberately. The valley watches, but it speaks only to those who notice." Leora's throat tightened, but she nodded. The weight of the journey, of the new world before her, pressed down, yet within it she felt a spark, a quiet determination to endure, to observe, and to understand the rhythm of the land. She did not yet know the valley's tests, nor the subtle currents of influence that ran through its labourers and overseers, but she was ready to begin learning. As the sun dipped lower behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields, Leora and Maril entered the settlement. The dust of the road clung to them still, but beneath it lay something stronger, the first traces of presence, awareness, and resilience. The valley had welcomed no one, yet here they were ready to meet it on its own terms. Chapter 2, learning the fields. The morning sun spilled over the hills, washing the valley in a pale gold that seemed to stretch endlessly across the barley fields. Leora stepped into the swaying stalks, the weight of her first basket heavier than she expected. Each movement demanded attention, the lift, the bend, the careful placement of each bundle, and yet she found herself watching everything else. The slight tilt of Maril's shoulders, the rhythm of the labourers' motions, the gentle sway of the fields as the wind moved through them. Maril moved beside her with quiet precision, her hands deftly arranging bundles and adjusting baskets with a grace born of years of experience. "The land will speak," she said softly, her eyes scanning the fields. "If you listen, it tells you what to do. Watch the stalks, the oxen, the labourers, each has its rhythm. Learn it and you will move without conflict, miss it and you will stumble." Nodded, feeling a shiver run through her. Observation was new to her. In her old world, tasks were often dictated by instruction or urgency. Here, the land and its people had a language all their own, and understanding it was more important than brute effort. She bent to lift a bundle of barley, feeling the strain in her arms and the uneven weight against her back. Her first few motions were awkward, missteps that made the stalks spill to the ground, forcing her to gather them again. Maril's hand brushed hers once in correction, gidding without words. Leora realized that patience, not speed, was the first lesson the valley demanded. Around them, labourers moved with an unspoken rhythm, their bodies synchronized with the pulse of the field. Leora began to notice the small signs, a glance between two workers, a pause before adjusting a stack, the subtle positioning of baskets to ease the flow of movement. Each detail, she realized, was a note in the silent song of the harvest. By mid-morning, Leora found herself adjusting to the pace. Her motions became smoother, her attention sharper. She began to anticipate the path of a bundle, the tilt of a basket, the hesitation of a younger worker. Maril's approving gaze met hers briefly, and a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It was a wordless acknowledgement that Leora had begun to understand the valley's language. The heat of the day pressed down and dust rose in lazy spirals with each step. Leora's clothes clung to her and sweat streaked her face, yet a quiet focus settled over her mind. This was not just labour. It was a test of attention, of endurance, and of patience. The valley demanded all three, and it offered no shortcuts. As the sun sank low, painting long shadows across the fields, Maril called a halt. "Observe," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Reflect. Tomorrow you will move not just with your hands, but with your mind. The field is a teacher if you are willing to learn." Leaned against a stack of bundles, feeling both exhaustion and a strange exhilaration. The valley had not spoken in words, yet it had begun to teach. And in its silence, she realized, lay the first hint of mastery. To endure, to observe, and to act with awareness in a world that watched, tested, and judged in ways subtle yet absolute. She watched the wind ripple across the barley, and for the first time felt a small spark of understanding. The valley was not simply land or labourers, it was a rhythm, a test, a teacher, and she had begun to listen. Chapter 3. Grief altered the proportions of the house. Rooms that had seemed narrow expanded into hollow spaces that carried sound too easily. Leora found herself listening for movements that no longer belonged to the living, the scrape of Sariel's sandals at the threshold, the uneven rhythm of his cough before dawn. Each time she caught herself waiting, she forced her hands back into motion. Stillness made memory louder, the valley did not pause for morning, work continued, carts passed, the river ran with indifferent steadiness. On the third morning after the burial, Sariel's brother rose before light and went to the fields alone. He returned after sunset with mud along his hem and something brittle in his expression. He avoided Leora's eyes, avoided his mother's gaze even more. Maril folded her son's outer garment and placed it at the bottom of a chest without ceremony. She did not weep in front of anyone, she did not speak Sariel's name unless necessary. But Leora noticed that at night she remained seated longer than usual, staring at the wall as though recalculating the architecture of her life. Food was no longer the immediate threat it had been in Bethar, yet security felt more fragile. They were guests here, temporary hands hired for a season. The landowners had been courteous in the way men are courteous when labour is useful. Widowhood changed the calculation. 2 widows in a foreign valley held little leverage. It was Maril who first said it aloud. "We are not anchored here." They sat on low stools near the doorway. Evening pressed cool air into the room. Sariel's brother had not yet returned. "We were not anchored there either," Leora replied before she could restrain herself. Maril's eyes lifted, not sharply, only steadily. Bethar was ours by inheritance. Inheritance did not keep him alive. The words settled between them, heavy and irreversible. Maril did not rebuke her. She considered the statement as one might consider a difficult truth offered without malice. Land cannot promise what bodies cannot sustain, she said at last, but it can remember who belongs to it. Thought of the terraces they had left behind, of the olive tree leaning west. She thought of the way she had memorized the bend in the path. Belonging, she was beginning to suspect, was not mutual. People clung, land endured, days lengthened. Sariel's brother grew quieter. The valley's harvest approached its height, and the strain of labor deepened the hollows beneath his eyes. One evening he returned later than usual, leaning heavily against the doorframe before stepping inside. "I slipped near the lower ridge," he said when Maril rose abruptly. "It is nothing," was not nothing. The fall had left him bruised along the ribs, breath shortened by more than pain alone. Within a week the same fever that had taken Sariel began its work again. This time there was no pretense of resilience. Leora recognized the signs before anyone spoke them. The heat beneath the skin. The glassy stare, the exhaustion that arrived too quickly. Maril moved through the small house with efficient restraint. She boiled water, changed cloths, sat through the night without closing her eyes, yet something in her posture had shifted. The first loss had cracked her. The second seemed to press her into iron. Leora found herself praying without words. Not to a name, not to a promise, only toward the vague idea that loss might have limits. She watched the rise and fall of the young man's chest and tried to imagine a different ending. But imagination held little authority over flesh. When he died, the silence was heavier than before. Two grave in foreign soil, two sons whose voices would not return. This time Maril did weep, not loudly, not with spectacle. The sound escaped her in a low, fractured breath as she knelt beside the body. It was the sound of something finally admitting defeat. After the burial, the house seemed to shrink again. 3 women had once occupied it. Now only 2. Neighbors came briefly, offering condolences shaped more by obligation than intimacy. They spoke of endurance, of the unpredictability of fever, of fate. Their words passed through the room and left no imprint. That night Leora lay awake on her mat, listening to the river beyond the settlement. It moved with steady insistence, indifferent to grave along its banks. She thought of Bethar, of dry wind and cracked terraces. She thought of Ash Valley and its false promise of refuge. Across the room, Maril's voice broke the darkness. "We will return," was not spoken with hope, it was spoken with decision. "To Bethar?" Leora asked quietly. "Yes. Is little waiting for us there? Is nothing holding us here?" Turned onto her side, facing the dim outline of her mother-in-law. She understood the pull of origin now, not as sentiment but as necessity. In Bethar at least they would grieve among familiar stones, among people who knew the names of the dead. "Will they receive us?" Leora asked. Maril was silent for a long moment. "They will remember me," she said, then more softly, "whether kindly is another matter." The river continued its measured course through the night. Leora closed her eyes and felt for the first time since Sariel's death a direction forming, not relief, not comfort, only movement. Sometimes survival was not found in greener valleys, sometimes it meant walking back through the dust. Chapter 4, Whispers at the Gate. Maril arrived first. She had walked ahead of Leora, testing the path, gauging how far the memory of Ash Valley clung to the hills. The wind had shifted overnight. It carried dust from distant roads and the faint tang of smoke. Her hands were folded in front of her, as if steadying herself against the weight of 2 graves she now carried with her. She reached the gate of Bethar just as the sun tilted low. The wood looked older, the iron rusted at the hinges. People moved about the square, pausing briefly to glance at the small procession of women who had returned in silence. Maril adjusted her shawl. She did not recognize anyone, and yet every face seemed to measure her. Leora came shortly after, silent, carrying the last bundle of their meager belongings. She walked behind Maril, close enough to lean on if necessary, but far enough to avoid seeming reliant. Every step was a negotiation with herself. How much grief could she show without inviting pity? How much resilience could she display without drawing suspicion? She had learned that appearances were as important as action in this place. At the gate, an elder stood, bent slightly, leaning on a staff that had likely carried him across decades of sun and stone. He regarded Maril and then Leora, eyes sharp but quiet. Maril inclined her head and stepped forward. The elder did not speak at once. He merely observed, as if measuring whether they belonged, whether their faces carried the map of a life spent elsewhere, or if their bodies could pass for locals. Maril spoke first, her voice low. "We have returned." She did not add more. Words would only fill space that the silence already commanded. The elder's gaze shifted to Leora. She met it steady. She had rehearsed the acknowledgement, the slight bow, the quiet, measured tone. She had not rehearsed the feeling of exposure that came with being seen as foreign, as other, as someone who had walked away and returned. Names, the elder said finally. Maril supplied them, herself her daughters-in-law. Leora's name sounded strange even in her own ears. She imagined how it would appear to others, different, not quite fitting. The elder murmured each name, knotting the cadence as if testing whether it would survive repetition. "You are allowed entry," he said at last. Not a welcome, not a blessing, a statement, neutral, fact, it was enough. Inside, the square buzzed with ordinary life. Children ran between carts and carts' wheels scraped against cobblestone. A dog barked at the edge of a market stall. Traders shouted brief, clipped calls to neighbors. Life moved on, indifferent to their absence, indifferent to their return. Maril's shoulders sagged just slightly. She had expected hostility, or at least curiosity sharpened into suspicion. Instead, the city met them with the quiet neutrality of routine. Leora followed her mother-in-law through narrow streets. Every step felt strange yet familiar, the scent of baked bread, the scrape of leather against cobblestone, the low hum of a language she had learned in fragments during their absence. She noted the gestures of people, the way hands moved over wares, the cautious distance maintained around them. The city itself had its own rhythms, and they were outsiders once again. That night in the rented house near the gate, Maril stood by the window, listening to the faint sounds of life beyond the walls. She thought about the valley they had left, about the children whose laughter now belonged to another place, about grave dug far from where their bodies had once been celebrated. She wondered how the city would receive grief carried silently, whether it could recognize loss that did not demand attention. Leora sat at the table, peeling a root for the evening meal. She thought of the first night they had arrived in Ash Valley, of fever and loss, of the heavy calm that followed the end of 2 lives. She thought about her own endurance, about how much she could carry without being crushed. And she realized that endurance was not measured by survival alone, but by the space one could hold inside oneself for sorrow and still move forward. The 2 women did not speak of the past. They did not need to. The city whispered around them, alive in its indifference, and in that quiet Maril and Leora began to understand something essential. That return was only the beginning of survival, and survival demanded more than movement. It demanded presence, attention, and a willingness to be recognized on one's own terms. The wind shifted again, carrying dust through the narrow streets. Outside, the city continued, unconcerned, unaware. Inside, the women felt the first stirrings of something neither grief nor fear could touch, a fragile sense of orientation, a way forward that belonged only to them. Chapter 5. Among the reapers the morning arrived with grey light spilling over the edges of the hills. Leora tightened her shawl against the chill and stepped into the fields before the others stirred. The barley stretched in waves, muted gold, bowing under its own weight. She could smell the soil, dry and faintly bitter, and hear the scrape of sickles from distant rows. The labourers were strangers, yet they had already established a rhythm. Leora watched them carefully, noting the pace, the gestures, the unspoken signals. There were rules in the fields: who cut first, who gathered next, who claimed which portion of fallen grain. She would have to learn them, not only to survive but to remain unseen enough that no one challenged her. She knelt beside a cluster of stalks, hands brushing over the grain, and remembered Ash Valley. There she had worked beside men who treated her with polite curiosity, their eyes soft with pity or respect. Here she felt only calculation. The farmers did not ask her name. They did not offer a hand. They only watched as she began, sharp and deliberate, imitating the motions she had seen. Time passed quietly, measured by the rhythm of the sickle and the rustle of barley falling into baskets. Sweat prickled at her forehead. She shifted weight from one knee to the other, and the muscles in her back protested. Hunger lingered like a dull ache, but she ignored it, pushing her focus toward repetition and endurance. Kedar, the owner of the field, appeared without announcement. He walked slowly along the rows, boots sinking slightly into the earth, his gaze moving over each labourer. When he reached Leora, he paused. She did not flinch. He said nothing, only studied the lines of her hands, the curve of her shoulders, the way she bent at the waist. Then he continued down the row without comment. Later, she noticed Maril standing at the edge of the field, hands on her hips, eyes scanning the horizon. The older woman's presence was a subtle kind of reassurance, an anchor against the precariousness of foreign soil. Leora caught Maril's glance and nodded, as if acknowledging that she was capable of bearing the day's work without complaint. Sun rose higher and the air grew heavy with dust and heat. Leora's palms blistered, her knees ached. She adjusted her shawl, wiping sweat from her brow. Around her, others worked in silence, some murmuring brief instructions, others singing low tunes that carried across the golden expanse. She felt herself attuning to the rhythm of this place, the subtle signals and cues that would keep her safe. By mid-afternoon, she had gathered enough barley to fill a small basket, yet she felt no pride. Survival did not require pride, only precision. She noticed a few glances directed her way, curious perhaps, or perhaps measuring how much she could bear, but she did not meet them. When the work ended, she walked back with Maril, baskets heavy with grain, their movements quiet and synchronized. The settlement was alive with ordinary concerns, children chasing one another, vendors calling for attention, the distant bark of dogs. The women moved through it like shadows, acknowledged but not claimed. That night, as Leora prepared the small meal, she thought about the field, about the rhythm of work and endurance, about the strange mixture of observation and invisibility that defined her existence here. She realized that loyalty was more than fidelity to people. It was an allegiance to action itself, to the slow accumulation of effort in the face of indifference. And in that realization, she found a quiet certainty, small, fragile, human, that would carry her forward, long before she could articulate what she truly hoped for. Chapter 6. The man who owned the field. Kedar moved through his fields with the careful patience of a man accustomed to weighing every step. The barley swayed under the late afternoon sun, gold and heavy, whispering against itself as the wind passed. He had come to the valley early that morning, inspecting the plots, noting the readiness of the grain. His eyes, sharp and practiced, scanned the labourers' movements with the detachment of someone used to responsibility without intimacy. He noticed her first. Not because she stood out in appearance, her shawl and posture marked her as cautious, yes, but because of how she approached the work. Her movements were deliberate, almost surgical, each cut measured, each handful of grain gathered with precision. She did not falter under the sun, she did not stumble over the uneven ground. There was something in her rhythm that suggested focus beyond mere survival. Kedar walked closer. The heat of the day pressed at his back, the faint scent of barley in the air. He studied her hands, calloused, careful, and the way her shoulders curved under the weight of her labor. He had seen many workers over the years, some eager, some slow, some skilled by circumstance. Few held the quiet attention she carried. She glanced up, meeting his gaze briefly, and then returned to her work. He did not speak. Words were unnecessary. Observation alone would suffice. He continued down the row, noting the pattern of labourers, the efficiency of some, the carelessness of others, and he returned to stand at the edge, watching as the day waned. Later, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the field, Kedar observed the women walking back toward the settlement. The elder widow moved with a measured pace, eyes forward, while the younger followed closely, slightly bent from the day's work, yet carrying herself with a quiet, unspoken determination. He considered the unusual weight of presence they brought with them. Not pride, not ceremony, but a distinct sense of awareness. The kind that made him wonder how much one could endure and still remain unbroken. There was a difference between someone who survived and someone who carried themselves like a survivor. She carried herself like the latter. That evening, Kedar stood at his window, looking toward the path the women had taken from the field. The sun had fallen behind the hills, leaving only the faint glow of twilight. He could still see them in memory, bent and deliberate. There was a silence in the act of working, a statement that needed no declaration. He did not yet know her name, but he would remember the impression she had left, quietly, without fanfare, without request. Night pressed against the settlement. Inside his house, he sat alone, considering the rhythm of work, the pattern of endurance he had witnessed, and the subtle shifts in human behavior that told stories more fully than words ever could. He thought of the coming days, of the responsibilities that awaited, and of the potential that lived quietly in those who bore hardship without complaint. Somewhere in the darkness, the distant river murmured. Somewhere else the women rested, unaware of the observation that had followed them back. The valley had returned to its usual indifference, and Kedar realized that in this quiet, attention was a form of possession, even if he did not yet intend to claim it. He allowed himself a rare thought. Perhaps some things would need tending more carefully than others. And some people, though strangers, might quietly insist on their place before he was aware it existed. Chapter 7. Bread shared in the shade. The sun had climbed high enough to burn the edges of the fields, and the labourers paused beneath the thin shade of an olive tree. Leora sank to her knees, hands resting in her lap. The warmth seeping through the rough cloth of her dress. Dust clung to her hair, to her arms, and though she had worked in heat before, today it felt heavier, almost deliberate. Maril appeared quietly, carrying a small clay jug and 2 pieces of bread wrapped in cloth. She settled beside Leora, setting the jug between them without a word. The elder woman's hands trembled slightly as she passed the bread, the movement careful, habitual, as though she were weighing each gesture for its weight in meaning. Leora accepted the bread and bit into it, dry and crumbly, tasting the grain of distant fields. "Thank you," she said softly, though the words felt unnecessary. Maril did not answer, only watched, letting the moment pass in the quiet shadow of the tree. The valley was alive with sound, the rustle of barley in the wind, the scrape of sickles from distant rows, the occasional murmur of a labourer, but none of it disturbed them. Kedar moved between the fields, his presence constant, observing without interruption, marking without interference. Leora felt his gaze brush past her, and she did not flinch. She had learned to work in plain sight without seeking attention, to move with the rhythm of the land and the labourers, to exist quietly but fully in each moment. "You are learning faster than I expected," Maril said, finally breaking the silence. "Not just the work, but the rhythm of it. You do not falter where others might." "I have to," Leora replied. Her voice was low, more to herself than to Maril. She thought of the fields they had left, of the hours bent over barley and stone, of Ash Valley and its indifferent fever. Precision was survival. Endurance was loyalty. Maril's gaze softened slightly. "Even in small things you choose how to endure," felt the weight of the statement and did not answer. She lifted the jug to her lips, drinking water that tasted faintly of clay, and let herself feel the sun's warmth without complaint. Around them the valley continued its business, indifferent and yet protective, a quiet observer that required nothing but respect. By the time the labourers returned to their homes, the day had thinned to a gentle hum of heat and wind. Maril and Leora gathered the empty clay jug and walked back to the settlement together. The streets were quieting, the vendors packing their wares, children scurrying toward evening. They moved through it as though a single thought connected them, a shared understanding of endurance and observation, of presence and restraint. That night, as Leora prepared the small meal, she noticed how Maril's hands moved with measured calm, how her eyes, though tired, scanned the room as if calculating the smallest details of survival. The air between them no longer held tension. It was steady now, marked by the quiet work of living, by the knowledge that endurance was not only a test of body, but of attention, observation, and careful choice. And in that quiet, the valley whispered around them, carrying the promise that some forms of safety, however fragile, could be earned through deliberate effort, patience, and the unspoken loyalty between women who had survived far too much to falter now. Chapter 8. Shadows along the valley. The morning air carried a faint chill, unusual for the season, and Leora noticed it as soon as she stepped into the fields. The barley swayed in slow waves under the wind, brushing against itself with a soft, whispering sound. She adjusted her shawl and bent to her work, noticing how each stalk resisted the sickle's cut in a slightly different way, how the earth shifted under her knees. Maril moved beside her without speaking, her eyes scanning the edges of the field, the movements of labourers and the paths that led to the settlement. Every gesture Maril made was precise, deliberate, and Leora absorbed them silently, learning the unspoken rules. Who watched closely, who left space, who tolerated mistakes. By midday, Kedar walked along the rows, boots sinking lightly into the dry soil. His gaze moved over every labourer, cataloguing efficiency, presence, and attention. He paused briefly when he reached Leora, observing the curve of her back, the tilt of her head, the steadiness of her hands. She met his eyes without hesitation, and the brief acknowledgement passed between them like a quiet agreement. He saw her, and she had learned to remain fully herself under scrutiny. The work continued in measured rhythm. The valley offered no interference, only expectation. Leora carried the basket steadily, shifting weight from arm to arm, mind trained to anticipate the subtle patterns around her. Maril occasionally touched her shoulder or tilted her head toward a labourer's motion, small interventions that taught Leora to navigate without drawing attention. By late afternoon, Maril guided her toward the periphery of the fields. "You must understand where observation counts most," she said softly. "Not just Kedar, but the labourers themselves. The valley tests you constantly in small ways, in silences." Leora nodded, sensing the meaning beyond the words. Each glance, each pause, each step measured against others' expectations could shift perception. Endurance alone was insufficient, attention and awareness were equally necessary. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Maril suggested they carry the empty baskets back through the settlement along a quieter path. Leora followed, careful to avoid drawing notice, yet aware of the weight she carried, not just the baskets but the accumulated impressions of labour, observation and discipline. That evening they prepared a modest meal in the small house. The silence between them was comfortable, a rhythm born of shared experience. Maril's eyes rested on Leora not with scrutiny but with recognition. the younger woman had begun to grasp the delicate balance of labor and perception, of endurance and discretion. Outside, the valley held its usual sounds: the distant river, children at play, the soft clatter of carts on cobblestones. Within the walls of the house, Leora understood the quiet lesson of the day. Survival was no longer only about work or strength. It was about knowing the rules, sensing the shifts, and moving through the shadows with deliberate care. And as night fell, the valley breathed around them, indifferent yet watchful, offering the possibility that persistence paired with awareness might one day yield safety, or something close enough to it. Chapter 8. Shadows along the valley. The morning air carried a faint chill, unusual for the season, and Leora noticed it as soon as she stepped into the fields. The barley swayed in slow waves under the wind, brushing against itself with a soft, whispering sound. She adjusted her shawl and bent to her work, noticing how each stalk resisted the sickle's cut in a slightly different way, how the earth shifted under her knees. Maril moved beside her without speaking, her eyes scanning the edges of the field, the movements of labourers and the paths that led to the settlement. Every gesture Maril made was precise, deliberate, and Leora absorbed them silently, learning the unspoken rules. Who watched closely, who left space, who tolerated mistakes. By midday, Kedar walked along the rows, boots sinking lightly into the dry soil. His gaze moved over every labourer, cataloguing efficiency, presence, and attention. He paused briefly when he reached Leora, observing the curve of her back, the tilt of her head, the steadiness of her hands. She met his eyes without hesitation, and the brief acknowledgement passed between them like a quiet agreement. He saw her, and she had learned to remain fully herself under scrutiny. The work continued in measured rhythm. The valley offered no interference, only expectation. Leora carried the basket steadily, shifting weight from arm to arm, mind trained to anticipate the subtle patterns around her. Maril occasionally touched her shoulder or tilted her head toward a labourer's motion, small interventions that taught Leora to navigate without drawing attention. By late afternoon, Maril guided her toward the periphery of the fields. "You must understand where observation counts most," she said softly. "Not just Kedar but the labourers themselves. The valley tests you constantly in small ways, in silences." Nodded, sensing the meaning beyond the words. Each glance, each pause, each step measured against others' expectations could shift perception. Endurance alone was insufficient, attention and awareness were equally necessary. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Maril suggested they carry the empty baskets back through the settlement along a quieter path. Leora followed, careful to avoid drawing notice, yet aware of the weight she carried, not just the baskets but the accumulated impressions of labour, observation and discipline. That evening they prepared a modest meal in the small house. The silence between them was comfortable. A rhythm born of shared experience. Maril's eyes rested on Leora not with scrutiny but with recognition. The younger woman had begun to grasp the delicate balance of labour and perception, of endurance and discretion. Outside, the valley held its usual sounds: the distant river, children at play, the soft clatter of carts on cobblestones. Within the walls of the house, Leora understood the quiet lesson of the day. Survival was no longer only about work or strength. It was about knowing the rules, sensing the shifts, and moving through the shadows with deliberate care. And as night fell, the valley breathed around them, indifferent yet watchful, offering the possibility that persistence paired with awareness might one day yield safety, or something close enough to it. Chapter 9. The threshing floor. Wind expanded. The threshing floor lay at the far edge of Kedar's property, wide and open, its pale stones sun-bleached and uneven, dust rising in light clouds with every footstep. Leora approached cautiously, baskets in hand, aware that this space demanded more than effort. It demanded presence, attention, and a quiet calculation she had not needed in Bethar or even Ash Valley. Maril followed behind, steady, her eyes sweeping the floor like a general reading the formations of an unfamiliar army, taking note of every movement, every pause, every unspoken claim of space. Labourers were already there, spread across the stones. Some tossed bundles of barley into the air for the animals to trample, others guided oxen over stalks, the steady, methodical rhythm of the work creating a low, constant hum across the open space. The wind lifted straw and dust, clinging to hair and sleeves, and yet the labourers continued without pause. Each gesture was practiced, efficient, a negotiation between strength and endurance, fatigue and necessity. Leora knelt beside a pile of barley, bending low, hands brushing over the stalks, cutting, separating, gathering. She moved in imitation of the others at first, but soon she noticed subtler rhythms: the slight tilt of the wrist that prevented splintering the stalks, the precise angle at which the sickle must meet grain to minimize effort, the packing of each bend so that exhaustion arrived slowly, not suddenly. She realized the threshing floor demanded intelligence as much as labor, attention as much as stamina. Kedar appeared without announcement, stepping lightly along the perimeter. His boots disturbed only faint clouds of dust, but the air shifted with his presence. He observed the laborers with quiet authority, cataloguing efficiency, precision, and endurance without speaking. When his gaze reached Leora, it lingered. Accusatory, not commanding, merely noting, the tilt of her back, the steadiness of her hands, the evenness of her breath. She met his eyes for a moment, unwavering, and felt a subtle acknowledgement pass between them. He saw her fully, and she had begun to claim her space under scrutiny. Maril moved closer, her voice low, guiding her from the side. Shift to the left, follow the shadow of the olive tree. Pace yourself with the rhythm of the oxen. Watch the worker by the east pile, he marks the time. Leora adjusted without hesitation. The small corrections Maril offered were like invisible scaffolding, allowing her to move with confidence while avoiding attention that might draw unnecessary judgment. The wind rose, lifting dust and chaff across the open floor. Leora felt it against her skin, in her hair, stinging her eyes, but she worked steadily. She became aware of patterns she had not noticed before: who claimed the best space near the pile, who paused to rest, who spoke in clipped murmurs to another. Maril's guidance had taught her to read the field without stepping outside her labor, to exist fully in the rhythm without ever dominating it. Hours passed. The sun climbed and waned, shifting the shadows across the stones. Leora bent, lifted, arranged, repeated until her muscles ached and her palms blistered. She noticed Kedar's presence at intervals, the way he would move down a row, pause for a moment, then continue, silently measuring the mettle of each laborer. She felt the weight of observation without fear, understanding that recognition could exist quietly without interference, and that her own endurance was her defense. By mid-afternoon, Maril whispered again, a subtle touch on Leora's shoulder. Keep your gaze level, move the right foot first on the incline, watch how the others adjust with the wind. Leora followed, noticing how subtle the corrections could be and how necessary. Survival here was not brute strength, it was rhythm, discretion, attention. As the workday drew to a close, the piles of separated grain stood neat, a testament to careful labor. Dust coated every surface, the air hummed faintly with the wind, and the valley seemed to exhale in muted satisfaction. Kedar lingered at the perimeter, still observing, noting the consistency of movement, the steadiness of hands, and Leora's particular precision. He had not spoken to her, but his attention carried weight. She felt it as palpably as Maril's guiding hand, and it was not threatening. It was a measure, a test, an acknowledgement. Maril stepped back slightly, observing Leora with satisfaction, though she did not smile. The younger woman had navigated the threshing floor without faltering, without drawing unnecessary attention, without error. She had begun to understand not only the labor itself, but the patterns, the subtleties, the unspoken rules of presence and endurance. Maril knew the valley's indifference demanded exactly this: awareness, measured motion, and the quiet control of one's place within a larger rhythm. As they carried the empty baskets back through the dust-strewn path toward the settlement, the wind lifted again, scattering the final traces of grain across the stones. Leora walked with Maril beside her, steady, aware, no longer merely a worker in the field but a participant in the valley's unspoken order. Observation, discretion, endurance all had converged on the threshing floor, and she had begun to master them. Night fell over the valley. The river murmured in the distance, the settlement quieted, and in the small house, Leora and Maril sat together in silence, exhausted but unbroken. The threshing floor had tested them, and the valley had offered its lesson. Strength alone was not enough. To survive, one must move deliberately, observe keenly, and hold oneself fully in every moment. Leora closed her eyes for a brief instant, feeling the rhythm of the day settle inside her, understanding that this, attention, endurance, and presence, was now her work as much as cutting grain. And in the distance, the wind continued to sweep the open floor, carrying whispers of dust, chaff, and the unspoken promise of mastery yet to come. Chapter 10. The quiet either morning light seeped over the hills in pale gold, casting long shadows across the barley fields. Leora moved among the stalks with quiet precision, her hands steady, her breathing measured. The wind lifted dust and straw, brushing her cheeks, tugging at her hair, and yet she adjusted naturally, sensing the rhythm of the field rather than fighting it. Every step, every cut of the sickle had become a language she understood. Maril followed a few paces behind, observing silently. There was no need to speak yet. Leora had begun to read the valley on her own. Subtle shifts in laborers' posture, the timing of breaths, the placement of baskets, these small signals dictated safety, influence, and survival. Maril's guidance had been invisible scaffolding, and Leora now walked confidently along it. Kedar's presence lingered at the field's perimeter, his boots stirring faint clouds of dust. Leora felt his gaze without turning, its weight steady and deliberate. She did not flinch. She had learned to carry her own measure of authority through endurance and awareness alone. Observation had become both shield and leverage, and she wielded it naturally. By midday, Maril leaned close for a whispered instruction. Shift to the left, follow the shadow of the tree, pace with the oxen, watch who pauses too long, who speaks too loudly. These are the signs you must note. Leora adjusted accordingly, subtly redirecting baskets, guiding hesitant workers, maintaining her rhythm while remaining unnoticed as a manipulator of the flow. The wind rose in the afternoon, tossing dust and chaff over the open floor. Leora felt it prick at her eyes, sting her skin, and yet she moved without hesitation. She began to notice deeper patterns, the way Kedar's gaze shifted, the hierarchy among labourers, the invisible tension that rose when one person misstepped or lagged. Maril's gentle touch, the brief guidance of her hand, reminded her that perception could be shaped without a word, influence wielded quietly and invisibly. Hours passed in the sun's weight. Sweat clung to Leora's skin. Her palms blistered from the repeated motion, but her mind stayed alert. She felt herself part of a rhythm far larger than the harvest itself. Every gesture, every glance, every small correction or adjustment was an assertion, subtle but real. Even Kedar's quiet acknowledgement was visible in the smallest nod he gave as he passed. Recognition came not from command, but from endurance, attention, and subtle mastery of space. By evening the labourers began to depart, their work done, and Maril guided Leora back toward the settlement along a narrow, quieter path. Dust rose behind them, lifted by the wind, and Leora felt the weight of the day settle in her bones, not exhaustion but accomplishment. She had moved among observation, scrutiny, and expectation without faltering, without drawing undue attention, and had learned the power of subtle influence. At the house they sat quietly together. Maril prepared a small meal while Leora organized the tools, each movement deliberate in rhythm and care. Silence held the room like a third presence, heavy with thought and reflection. Leora realized she had learned something beyond labor. She had learned to inhabit space fully, to endure visibly, and to be recognized quietly without asking for it. The river murmured beyond the hills, soft and steady, as if marking the valley's indifference, and yet within that indifference Leora had carved a place for herself. The day had ended, but the lessons of attention, endurance, and subtle authority would carry forward, shaping each coming moment. Chapter 11. Whispers of recognition. The morning sun crept over the hills, spilling pale light across the fields. Leora moved through the barley with quiet, assured steps, each movement deliberate, each cut of the sickle precise. She no longer merely followed Maril's guidance, she anticipated it, reading the field as one reads a familiar story. The labourers themselves began to notice the steadiness of her work, though none spoke aloud. Their glances, brief and measured, carried acknowledgement. Maril walked just behind her, eyes sharp, observing every interaction, every subtle exchange. She did not need to speak. Leora had internalized the lessons of observation and discretion. Still, Maril occasionally leaned close, whispering one or two words, subtle nudges that reminded Leora the valley demanded careful attention even in moments of confidence. Kedar appeared later than usual, moving slowly along the perimeter, boots stirring fine dust with each step. He stopped briefly to watch a group of labourers, then lingered where Leora worked. His gaze was calm but calculating, noting posture, the steadiness of hands, the rhythm of breaths. For the first time he allowed his eyes to rest on her longer than necessary, as though measuring not just her labour but the quiet influence she had begun to exert on those around her. Leora felt it, though she did not shift or stumble. The acknowledgement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight. Maril's hand brushed lightly against her shoulder, a small approving gesture. She understood now that recognition could exist without words, a quiet nod that marked presence, capability, and reliability. The day stretched on, long and warm. Dust clung to the barley, to the labourer's hair, and to Leora's arms. She bent, lifted, sorted, and adjusted baskets with the same rhythm she had carried for weeks. Each movement was an act of precision, each pause an opportunity to observe the shifts in others' attention. She felt the subtle hierarchy of the field around her, the glances, the small hesitations, the unspoken claims to space, and she navigated it smoothly, invisibly asserting authority without declaration. By afternoon, Maril whispered again, "See how they watch you, not with disdain nor curiosity but calculation. Your presence matters, use it wisely." Leora nodded, letting the words sink. Presence was power, not through command but through steadiness, observation, and thoughtful action. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the field, Kedar approached Maril briefly. Leora observed from a distance, her work uninterrupted, as he spoke quietly, deliberately. "She has learned more than endurance," Kedar said. "She has learned to be seen without asking, to act without asserting." Maril inclined her head subtly. "Yes, she moves with understanding now. She is no longer simply laboring, she is participating." Kedar's gaze swept over the field one last time, lingering on Leora, and then he departed silently, leaving only the hum of work and the rustle of barley. Leora felt a quiet thrill, not of pride but of recognition. She had survived scrutiny, mastered attention, and shaped perception through subtle, deliberate action. As they returned home, the wind lifting dust behind them, Leora realized that the valley had shifted slightly, not in its indifference but in her place within it. Observation, discretion, endurance, and subtle influence had become her tools, and through them she had begun to claim the quiet respect of both the land and those who governed it. That evening, Maril prepared a modest meal while Leora tended the small hearth. Their silence was comfortable, heavy with thought and reflection. The valley outside remained patient, indifferent, unyielding, yet within its embrace Leora had discovered a measure of control, a quiet mastery over perception and presence that no labor alone could provide. Chapter 12. Evening decisions. The sun lingered low over the hills, casting long, trembling shadows across the barley fields. The heat of the day had faded, leaving a soft warmth that made the dust rise in lazy spirals with every step. Leora moved among the stalks, steady, attentive, each gesture measured. The rhythm of the work was familiar now. It was no longer just labor, it was strategy. Every movement was a conversation with the valley, with the laborers, and with Kedar's quiet, ever-present gaze. Maril walked beside her, her eyes sharp and deliberate, scanning the field, noting the subtle shifts in attention and posture among the workers. She had guided Leora this far, but now her daughter-in-law's understanding surpassed instruction. Leora anticipated the smallest gestures, which labourer would hesitate, where the oxen might stumble, which shadow offered cover for a quick adjustment of baskets. Maril's soft whispers had become unnecessary. Leora could read the field on her own. "The time will come," Maril said at last, her voice low, almost swallowed by the wind, "when endurance will not be enough. You must act deliberately and the valley will test you." Nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. The valley had a rhythm of its own, indifferent, unyielding but patient. She felt its attention as keenly as Kedar's, subtle yet inescapable. She had learned to inhabit space, to move with awareness, and to be seen without demanding recognition. Now Maril hinted that it was time for more than observation, time to act within the quiet rules of the valley. Kedar appeared at the perimeter, boots stirring dust as he moved. His gaze passed over the labourers and lingered on Leora, noting her calm precision, the control she exercised without assertion. She met his eyes steadily, unflinching, aware of the silent acknowledgement in his observation. The recognition was not for labour alone, it was for presence, for understanding, for the subtle mastery of influence. The wind picked up, lifting chaff and dust across the floor. Leora adjusted the positioning of the baskets, quietly signalling to the hesitant labourers which way to move, guiding them without a word. Maril's eyes followed each motion, approving though she said nothing. This was Leora's first lesson in initiative, the delicate assertion of authority without speech, without command, without breaking the invisible rules that governed the valley. By evening the work was done. The labourers had returned to their homes, the sun had begun to sink behind the hills, and the valley exhaled in a long, patient hush. Leora walked with Maril along the narrow path back to the settlement, carrying empty baskets but feeling a weight far greater, an understanding of how perception could be shaped quietly, subtly, without conflict. At the small house, Maril prepared a modest meal, and Leora helped, each movement deliberate, each action measured. Silence filled the room, heavy with thought and reflection. Leora understood now that survival required more than endurance, more than attention. It required careful action, initiative, and subtle influence. The valley, patient and indifferent, had taught its lesson. Those who moved deliberately, who understood the rhythm and attention of others, carved a space for themselves without demand or assertion. Night fell, cool and soft, carrying the distant murmur of the river through the valley. Leora sat quietly by the hearth, Maril beside her, and for the first time felt the full measure of the lessons she had learned. She had endured scrutiny, shaped perception, and exercised subtle influence. The valley, indifferent yet exacting, had yielded its quiet acknowledgement, and within it Leora had discovered a nascent power, the ability to act, to guide, to command attention without speaking. The harvest still awaited its final days, but Leora felt ready. Endurance, observation, and careful initiative had become her tools. And the valley, patient and eternal, would continue to test her, but she would meet it with steady hands, calm eyes, and the quiet authority she had learned to carry. Chapter 13. The turning point. The wind rose sharply that morning, lifting dust and chaff into swirling clouds across the threshing floor. The valley, so patient and indifferent in its usual rhythm, seemed restless. The barley stalks bent and snapped under the gusts, and the oxen shifted uneasily beneath their burdens. Leora adjusted the straps of her basket, feeling the weight both physical and symbolic, the culmination of weeks of careful labor, observation, and endurance. Today would be different. She sensed it in the tension carried by the laborers, in Maril's quiet vigilance, and in Kedar's deliberate, measured steps along the perimeter. Maril walked close, but at a slight distance, letting Leora occupy the center of attention. "Remember," she whispered, "the valley rewards precision and perception. Not every action is seen, but every inaction is noticed. Move deliberately, think ahead, and let your presence speak without words." Leora's chest tightened with anticipation, but her hands remained steady. She had learned to read the subtle hierarchies, the hesitations, the glances, the brief exchanges of eye contact among laborers. She now understood how influence could be exercised quietly, how guidance could flow invisibly through her movements. She shifted the baskets carefully, directing the hesitant laborers with slight gestures, subtle adjustments, a nod here, a pause there, guiding the rhythm of the work without ever raising her voice. Kedar approached, his boots stirring clouds of dust in slow, deliberate rhythm. He moved along the edge of the threshing floor, pausing at intervals to observe, catalogue, and assess. Leora felt the weight of his gaze, the intensity of scrutiny. For the first time, it felt like more than observation. It felt like judgment tempered with consideration, a measuring of her mastery beyond the work itself. She did not flinch. She adjusted her position, aligning with Maril's subtle guidance while trusting her own judgment. A moment came when a young laborer misstepped, stumbling near the stacked bundles. In an instant, Leora acted, stepping lightly to intercept the falling basket, repositioning it with a smooth motion and signaling to the others the path they should follow. No one spoke. The valley, indifferent, observed only the outcomes of action. Kedar's eyes lingered on her, just long enough for her to sense acknowledgement. Maril's hand brushed hers ever so briefly, a gesture of quiet approval. The day stretched on, each gust of wind, each shift in the oxen, each movement of the workers testing her alertness. Leora navigated every complication with calm precision, weaving her influence invisibly through the field. By mid-afternoon, even the older laborers who had long measured her as newcomer began to adjust to her subtle direction. Their movements fell into the rhythm she guided, without words, without commands, only the quiet assertion of presence and attention. As the sun dipped lower, Kedar paused once more at the perimeter. His gaze swept over the field, noting the order, the flow, the coordination. Finally, he allowed the faintest of nods, a silent acknowledgement of competence and control. Leora felt the shift fully. She had passed the valley's test. Endurance alone was no longer enough. Perception, subtle influence, and deliberate initiative had earned recognition. Maril stepped back, letting Leora occupy the space fully. "You see it now," she said softly. "The valley responds to those who move with awareness. You are no longer just present. You are part of its rhythm. You influence it without breaking it." Arrived with a soft hush over the fields, dust floated in the last rays of sunlight, and the laborers left in silence, returning to their homes with the subtle marks of the day's guidance imprinted in their movements. Leora walked beside Maril along the narrow path back to the settlement, her arms heavy but her mind steady. She understood for the first time that influence could be wielded quietly, without assertion, and recognition could be earned without demand. That night the house was quiet. Leora sat by the hearth, feeling the ache of the day in her muscles but a steady calm in her mind. The threshing floor had been a test, and she had met it with precision, awareness, and initiative. The valley remained patient, indifferent, and exacting, but within it Leora had claimed something far greater than survival. She had claimed presence, influence, and the quiet acknowledgement of power earned through skill and subtlety. Chapter 14. Harvest completed. The valley breathed softly in the early morning, its hills bathed in gold that shimmered across the fields. Leora stepped into the barley, her feet sinking lightly into the dust, her hands steady as they moved over the stalks. The final days of harvest had arrived, and the rhythm of labor felt less like survival and more like mastery. Every motion, every glance, every adjustment of baskets or bundles carried purpose, every breath was synchronized to the pulse of the field. Maril walked beside her, silent but vigilant, letting Leora take the lead. "Today," she whispered, "you are not just enduring, you are guiding. The valley has given you its measure and now you shape it." Leora felt the weight of the words settle within her. They were not a command but a reminder of the lessons she had absorbed: observation, endurance, attention, and subtle initiative. The tools of survival had become instruments of influence. The laborers moved around her with quiet efficiency, but Leora noticed the changes. They hesitated less, fell into rhythm more easily, and unconsciously aligned with her motions. Even the older workers, who had once watched her with suspicion, now followed her cues without question. Maril's subtle instruction had faded into guidance born of action. Leora's authority was present but unspoken, invisible yet undeniable. Kedar's presence, ever at the perimeter, had shifted too. He walked slowly along the edge of the field, his eyes tracking the movements of laborers and baskets, but now his attention seemed more measured, more contemplative. When he paused near Leora, he did not speak, yet she felt his acknowledgement, a recognition not only of endurance but of initiative, skill, and quiet mastery. His nod, slight and fleeting, carried more weight than any spoken praise. The wind rose in soft gusts, lifting dust and barley chaff, and Leora adjusted the placement of bundles, subtly guiding the flow of labor. A young worker hesitated near a bundle that threatened to topple, and she reached out instinctively, steadying it with a gentle touch while signaling the others with a slight tilt of her head. No words were exchanged, yet the rhythm held. The valley's tests had demanded endurance, observation, and perception, but today they demanded subtle authority, and Leora exercised it with precision. By late afternoon, the sun had lowered to the horizon, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose. The final bundles were secured, the last oxen guided across the stone floor, and the field lay orderly, dust settling like a soft blanket over the laborers' work. Maril watched quietly from the edge of the field, her eyes tracing the flow of movements, noting the steadiness in Leora's posture, the quiet command she wielded without words. The laborers departed silently, carrying their tools and baskets, leaving behind the hushed echoes of coordinated effort. Leora walked beside Maril along the path back to the settlement, her steps measured, her breath calm. For the first time she felt the valley's indifference yield in subtle acknowledgement. Endurance had earned survival, observation had earned recognition, and deliberate initiative had earned influence. That evening the house was calm. Maril prepared a modest meal while Leora tended the hearth. Silence filled the room, but it was not empty. It carried the weight of mastery, of lessons learned and applied, of influence exercised quietly and effectively. Leora understood fully now that the valley, patient and indifferent, had its own way of acknowledging those who moved deliberately, who understood the rhythm of its people, and who acted with foresight and subtlety. As night fell, the river murmured faintly in the distance. Leora sat by the hearth, Maril beside her, and she let herself feel the depth of accomplishment. The harvest had ended, but the lessons remained. Endurance, observation, attention, and subtle action were no longer just tools, they were power. The valley had tested her and she had passed. Recognition, influence, and quiet authority were now hers, earned not through demand but through understanding, care, and deliberate action. For the first time in the valley, Leora felt at home, not merely surviving but present, seen, and in harmony with the rhythms of the land and those who moved within it. The valley, in its patience and indifference, had given its measure, and she had met it fully. Chapter 15, Return and Resolve. Night settled over the valley like a soft, silent blanket. The river whispered in the distance, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and barley dust. Leora stood at the doorway of their small house, gazing across the fields she had learned to navigate, the threshing floors she had mastered, and the paths she now understood as extensions of her own rhythm. She had endured, observed, acted, and finally influenced the life around her. The valley, patient and exacting, had tested her, and she had emerged not merely unbroken, but changed. Maril joined her quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You have learned more than survival," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that Leora felt in her chest. "You have learned to be seen without demanding it, to guide without speaking, to act deliberately in a world that measures every misstep." Nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The laborers' huts were dark now, smoke curling faintly from distant hearths. Kedar's house, perched on its rise, seemed quiet too, the faint flicker of a lantern in a window the only sign of his presence. She remembered the days when she had entered this valley as an outsider, uncertain and wary, uncertain of her place and her power. Now she understood that authority, recognition, and respect did not always come from command. They came from endurance, awareness, and subtle action. The evening wind swept across the fields, lifting loose chaff and carrying the distant sound of the river. Leora felt the weight of the day and the weeks that had led to this moment settle in her shoulders. The valley had not changed, it was still patient, indifferent and exacting, but she had changed with it. She had learned to move within its rules, to influence without demanding, to occupy space with quiet confidence. Maril glanced at her, eyes soft but sharp. The harvest is complete, the laborers have seen you, Kedar has seen you, but more than that, you have seen yourself. This valley may test you again, but now you have learned its rhythm. You can act, guide and endure in ways others may not even notice. Felt a quiet satisfaction, deeper than pride, more enduring than relief. She understood that the power she now carried was not in authority alone, but in the mastery of perception, in the careful shaping of presence, and in the patient accumulation of small acts that changed outcomes without breaking rhythm. That night they ate a modest meal by the hearth. Outside, the valley settled into its natural quiet. The laborers' huts were dark, the river murmured faintly, and the wind whispered through the barley. Leora felt a sense of completion, but also a readiness to continue moving through the world with the lessons she had learned. The valley had given its measure, and she had met it fully. As sleep approached, Maril reached over and took her hand. "You are ready," she said, "not just to survive but to act with awareness. The valley respects that, even if it never speaks. You have returned not to the place you left but to a new home, one where presence and perception carry power." Closed her eyes and let herself feel the depth of those words. The valley had been exacting, but it had yielded quiet recognition. She had endured, observed, guided and acted. She had survived, and in doing so she had claimed something more lasting. The knowledge that careful action, subtle influence and steadfast presence could shape the world around her without confrontation, without demand but with undeniable effect. The night deepened, carrying the scent of barley and the distant hum of the river. Leora and Maril rested, each in their own quiet reflection, knowing that the lessons of endurance, observation and subtle authority would remain long after the harvest was complete. The valley, indifferent yet exacting, had tested them and they had passed. They had returned not merely to survival but to mastery of themselves and their place within the rhythm of life around them. And for the first time the valley felt fully inhabited, not just by laborers or overseers but by Leora, whose presence had quietly reshaped the world around her. Chapter 16, Seeds of Tomorrow. The valley woke slowly, soft light spilling over hills that had watched them grow. Leora rose before the sun, the lingering dust of the harvest still clinging faintly to her hair and hands. She stepped outside into the cool morning air, inhaling deeply. The fields were quiet now, the laborers' work complete, yet the pulse of the land remained steady and patient, as if it had noticed the subtle changes in those who had endured its tests. Maril joined her at the edge of the settlement, their shadows long on the path. "The valley always remembers," she said, her voice carrying faint warmth. "Not in words, but in the way it shifts around those who move with understanding. You have planted seeds, Leora. Today you will see them begin to grow." Leora's gaze swept across the fields. Where she had once walked uncertain, now she noticed patterns that would have gone unseen before. Baskets stacked with ease, laborers moving in quiet harmony, pathways cleared by subtle guidance. Even small gestures, an adjusted bundle here, a gidding nod there, had begun to ripple outward, influencing movement, perception and coordination without a word. Kedar appeared on the rise, his silhouette framed by the pale light. He moved slowly, his boots pressing dust into the earth, yet his gaze did not waver. Leora met his eyes briefly, and in that look she felt acknowledgement, not just of past endurance but of ongoing influence, of a presence that shaped the rhythm of the valley without demanding it. He gave no nod this time, but it was unnecessary. She understood that power did not always need recognition to exist, it had quietly taken root. As the morning wore on, Leora walked the length of the fields, Maril following close, teaching her the subtleties of long-term guidance. "Influence," Maril said softly, "is not always immediate. Sometimes it grows slowly, unnoticed, until one day it shapes everything." Leora nodded, sensing the truth in the statement. She had endured, she had observed, she had acted, but now she understood that the work of perception, subtlety and presence was ongoing. The valley did not yield to those who sought quick reward, it yielded to those who moved with awareness and care over time. The laborers passed her, acknowledging her presence not with words but with deference in posture, rhythm in movement. Even the youngest workers, who had once been uncertain and hesitant, now followed the subtle guidance of her gestures, aligning with the flow she had cultivated. Leora realized that her quiet authority had begun to take root, not through fear or command, but through patience, skill and deliberate action. By afternoon the wind carried the scent of barley and earth, and the valley seemed to exhale. Leora and Maril paused at the edge of the threshing floor, watching the subtle harmony of labor, the quiet acknowledgement of those who had learned to follow her rhythm. "You see," Maril said, "this is the reward of patience, of attention, of presence. Not applause, not words, but quiet, enduring influence." The sun sank behind the distant hills, casting amber shadows across the valley. Leora felt a profound sense of completion. She had returned not just to survival, not just to recognition, but to lasting presence. The valley itself had absorbed her lessons, and in return she had learned the depth of patient mastery. Night fell deep and soft. The river murmured faintly, carrying away the echoes of labor and dust. Leora and Maril sat outside their home, silent together, feeling the life of the valley move around them. The stars began to appear, pale and steady, like witnesses to their journey. Leora understood now that the valley's lessons were not only for survival, they were for shaping the unseen currents of life, for planting seeds of quiet influence that could endure far beyond one season, one harvest, or one recognition. And in that stillness she felt a promise. The valley would continue to test, to shift, to demand attention, but she had learned to move within it with calm eyes, steady hands, and the patient wisdom of one who understood the rhythm of presence itself. The seeds of tomorrow had been planted, and she at last had the knowledge to guide their growth.